Well, I, and by extension you, actually, we find ourselves in something of a strange position this morning. I am about to preach a sermon on preaching a sermon. It's kind of like, writing a book on how to write a book, or carving a little pig sculpture out of Spam, It's like the medium is the message. The contents of the can is shaped into that which went into the can. This could get a little bit weird today. So, in fact, I can pretty much guarantee this will get weird because what Paul writes here in this passage, 1 Corinthians 2, 1 through 5, it is almost 100% counterintuitive. It flies in the face of conventional wisdom. It takes everything that you thought you knew about public speaking and then turns it on its head. In fact, after much thought and deliberation, I chose to title this section of the letter, 1 Corinthians 2, 1 through 5, Paul's Paradigm for Lousy Public Speaking. That's really what it is. You might have heard of the book, the classic book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, right? Well, this would be Paul's version of how to lose arguments and gain enemies. Right here, that's what you're going to get. So brace yourself. Things could get a little bit weird. But this weirdness is not a bad thing, not a liability for this passage, because in fact, it is this very weirdness that makes this passage so hopeful and helpful for every single one of us here. Because as most of you know, sharing the message of Jesus is not just the job of apostles like Paul. It's also not just the job of pastors or missionaries. Sharing the message of Jesus is mandatory for all Christians. It's something that we are all called to do. Kind of one way of thinking about this is as fitting under the command to love your neighbor as yourself. If the very best thing that has happened to you, if the very best thing that can happen to anyone is coming to know God through his Son, Jesus Christ, then the very best thing that you can do for anyone is introduce them to Jesus, period. This is something we know. The problem is, for many of us, introducing someone else to Jesus, just talking about Jesus to someone who doesn't know him, it's not something that we really do all that often if you look at how we spend most of our time. It's actually, it's one of the reasons I felt a little bit uncomfortable as I was thinking about and preparing the sermon this week. It's because evangelism is one of those topics that it is so easy to just send Christians on a guilt trip about. Earl said that the topic is kind of like prayer, or giving money to the poor. It's one of those topics where if someone asks you, how are you doing on that? Basically, the answer is always, well, not enough. I could always be doing a little more praying. I could always be giving a little bit more. And so when it comes to evangelism, a lot of times we think about how often we've actually talked about Jesus with someone who doesn't know him in the last month, year, week, and we think, man, what's wrong with me? Getting introduced to Jesus, best thing that ever happened to me. So why do I have so much trouble actually getting to the point of introducing him to other people? In other words, the question we're thinking about is, what keeps you from sharing the message of Jesus the way that you should? And far too often, I know this is true for me, probably for many of you, the more that I think about this question, the worse I feel about it, and then the less inspired I am to actually do something about it. I really don't want it to be that sort of message where you just kind of leave feeling guilty and that's it. And really, I don't think that it will be. That is the beauty of Paul's paradigm right here in 2, 1 through 5. What Paul writes in these 5 verses, it is so counterintuitive. It is so contrary to the prevailing wisdom of our day, the prevailing wisdom of his day when it comes to the art of persuasion, that it's liberating. It's inspiring. It's encouraging to anyone here this morning who might feel like a failure when it comes to evangelism. I know I was encouraged actually every day as I was studying it this week. I hope you all walk out of here encouraged and inspired as well. But also challenged. Because there are some of us here who need encouragement when it comes to sharing the message of Jesus, to be reminded we're not failures, that God is going to sustain us, keep us going. But the other side here is there are probably some of you sitting out here, okay? I'm not making eye contact with you right now, who might need something more like a kick in the hindquarters when it comes to this area. And this passage actually gives us both. So what we're going to do as we work our way through these verses this morning is we're going to start with the encouragement, how it is that Paul's paradigm right here should really encourage anyone who feels like a failure at sharing the message of Jesus. And then we're going to get to the kick in the pants, like what keeps me from sharing the message of Jesus the way that I should. And then finally, we're going to end with hopefully some inspiration for you, as a flesh and blood, real-life example of the kind of witness paradigm that Paul recommends right here. So encouragement, kick, inspiration. That's my idea of a great Sunday morning, so hope you're here. I'm glad you're here. We're going to get going right now. 1 Corinthians 2, 1 through 5. Paul's paradigm for lousy public speaking. Step 1, choose an audience that is predisposed to be hostile to your message. All right? Verse 1, and I, when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. So a little bit of context here. Paul is looking backward at this point in the letter, way back actually to when he first met these Christians in Corinth, the people he's writing the letter to, when he first met them 2 years ago. Really one of the cool things about studying this letter is that this letter is not our only source about the Corinthians or what was going on there. We actually have another source, very important, right there in your Bible, the book of Acts. And Acts 18, chapter 18, gives this account of Paul's time in Corinth. How he first showed up in this big, beautiful Greek city and started sharing the gospel and, working at making tents and kind of had some adventures there. It'd actually be a really good chapter for you to read this week if you have time. Acts chapter 18. Give you a lot of similar themes to what we'll be studying today, but then also provide you with more background as we keep working through the letter. So Acts 18 for you overachievers out there would be a good one to take a glance at. Because what Paul is doing here, in this section, is he's looking back to what happened in Acts 18, that time he spent in Corinth. He's asking the Corinthians to think back to that, to the example that Paul set for them when he was there in the flesh, and consider what he did. That's why I've called this section Paul's paradigm. You could have called it Paul the paradigm, right? Because he's pointing to himself as a model or an illustration for them to consider. This is something Paul is not shy about doing. Later in the letter, he says it straight up. He says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Do what I do. And that's what he's doing here. He's saying, do what I did, or think about what I did and how it should change your attitude. But before we get on to Paul's description of actually what happened in the next couple verses, just pause for a second and reflect on that word right there, you. When I came to you, brothers. Simply by going to Corinth at all, of all the cities in the ancient world at the time, and choosing to try to tell these particular people about Jesus, Paul is doing something quite contrary to conventional wisdom. He has selected an audience that's predisposed to be hostile to his message. Corinth, think back to our very first message on this city. It's Sin City, right? It's the ancient mixture of New York meets Las Vegas is how one Bible scholar describes it. There's in-your-face sexuality, lots of money, power and pleasure all in one place. And so the Corinthians, not surprisingly, were a product of this culture. There, idols everywhere, temples everywhere, prostitutes everywhere, exploitation, greed everywhere. These are not people that you would put on a list of most likely to embrace Jesus. Especially when you consider that Paul wasn't willing to water down the message or modify it, not even one little bit. Step 2 of Paul's paradigm for lousy public speaking: choose highly offensive, hard to understand content. Verse 2, "For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified." You know, it's easy for us Christians today to forget how really odd and offensive the message of a crucified Jesus would seem to people in the Roman Empire who would be hearing this message for the very first time. You know, like we see crosses everywhere. We see crosses on churches, hospitals, jewelry, tattoos, you know. They're everywhere. Romans would also see crosses quite frequently, but never as art or a fashion statement. Romans would see crosses standing along their highways, usually at the entrance or the exits of major cities like Corinth, and these crosses were usually occupied by various states of dead or dying naked men. Crucifixion was a slow death. The death of Jesus was surprisingly fast, actually. The gospel writers make note of it when they tell Pilate, "We want the body." Pilate's like, "Wait, he's dead already?" That was really fast. Usually, death on a cross took days. It was a slow death of progressive weakness, progressive suffocation, and this was all intentional. Both the publicness of the death, the slowness of the death was not so much to inflict maximum pain as it was to inflict maximum shame. Sometimes we get way too distracted in our culture thinking about, the pain of the cross, and that is a big part of it. They wanted it to hurt, but they weren't just thinking, how can we make this person hurt the most? There's other ways they could have done that. What they were trying to think is, how can we shame this person the absolute most? Remember, honor and status, those were the true currency of the Roman Empire. Nothing was more important than prestige. Nothing was worse than losing your prestige. And crucifixion represented the ultimate loss of prestige. Crucifixion meant that you were deemed unworthy of all honor, even the honor of a public beheading. It's weird to think of someone who's sentenced to death stressing out about their honor at all, but it was a big deal. If you said, "Hey, we're going to lop your head off instead of having you crucified," that meant a lot because you could at least preserve your honor, if not your life. For a Roman, it would be hard to imagine a worse fate than crucifixion. There was a curse at the time in which people would say to one another when they were really angry, "Be crucified," which is basically the equivalent of our "go to hell." Something, I hope that you experience the worst fate we can possibly imagine. Be crucified. Because in a culture that valued strength, crucifixion was the ultimate designation that you are weak. In a culture that valued insiders and, being in the good position, the right circles, crucifixion was the ultimate designation that you are an outsider. In a culture that valued beauty, crucifixion forced you to die in utter ugliness, naked, public, bloody shame. In a culture that valued victory, crucifixion was the ultimate defeat. And at the heart of Paul's preaching to this very Roman city, the content of his message, as he puts it here, was Christ crucified. It is hard to imagine more difficult content to preach to the people of Corinth. I mean, it would be hard enough to just preach Christ, period. Like if he was just going to try to say, this is who Jesus is. Leave the cross out of it. This is the person of Jesus. They'd be like, wait, you're saying there's one God, not many gods? And then you're saying that this one true God who created absolutely everything, no other gods in the world, this God became a human being? Like this God-man hybrid walking around the village in some obscure Roman province way down to the south that nobody even cares about? Sorry, Paul, we're not buying that. I mean, these are the objections Paul would have to face simply by preaching Christ. Now imagine preaching Christ crucified. It is emphatic the way that this is written in the Greek. Christ crucified. All that stuff, those aspects of the nature of God and the person of Jesus, it's already hard to believe. Now add to the fact that the central feature of the story of this, no-name Palestinian peasant with the God complex is his own crucifixion. How's that going to go over in Corinth? Paul chose to preach nothing but Christ and him crucified. No matter where you are, no matter what culture you're in, this message will always be offensive. As Paul writes just before this, what Bruce preached on a couple weeks ago, the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing. It's true in Paul's culture. It is true in our culture for actually very different reasons than it was back then. Actually, there's an article I read last week written by a man named Josh Pease that reflects on the foolishness of the cross in our culture, why it is that people in our culture think that doesn't make sense, that's not right, in light of the recent trial of Dr. Larry Nassar. Nassar, as many of you know, was recently convicted of sexually assaulting 150 young girls during his time as doctor for the U.S. women's gymnastics team. But despite the conviction, despite being almost universally condemned by people on social media and news, despite hearing personally from dozens of victims who made statements describing the damage that Nassar had inflicted upon them, Dr. Nassar maintained his conviction of his basic goodness as a person to the very end. Here's how he put it in a letter that he wrote to the judge. It was read aloud at his trial. He said, "I was a good doctor, because my treatments worked. And those patients that are now speaking out were the same ones that praised and came back over and over and referred family and friends to see me. The media convinced them that everything I did was wrong and bad. They feel I broke their trust. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. It is just a complete nightmare." Now, when this statement was read aloud at the trial, the people in the courtroom, the people watching on the news, they were justly infuriated by those statements. And this was true for people regardless of their belief or background. Like, how could this man call himself a good doctor? How could he use the adjective good at all related to what he had done? How can he blame the media for this nightmare that he's going through? How dare he imply that the victims deserve some of the blame for all this? This letter is an example of how even the worst of sinners can go to hell screaming at the top of their lungs that they are good, that they are righteous, that everyone else is the problem. And this is terrifying. What the writer of this article went on to point out is that as much as we are right to condemn the actions of criminals who abuse others like Dr. Nassar, he points out that this same delusion that, we are good, this persists to some extent in all of us, especially in our culture today in the United States. Because one of the most treasured values of American culture right now is authenticity. Being who you really are. It's like you don't need to look outward to any moral authority or other higher institution to guide your behavior. What you got to do is you got to look inward and do what's right for you. So then self-expression becomes the highest good, whatever that is for you. Achieving your dreams, following your heart. These are what you were born to do. Don't let anyone else tell you otherwise. This raises some very serious problems, though. What is good? What if what I say is good isn't what you say is good, or what most people say is good? What if your heart is leading you in a very dark direction? What if, in pursuit of what you honestly think are your deepest longings, you must exploit other people? What if, if yourself is the highest authority in matters of right and wrong, then what other voice, no matter how strongly they are speaking, will be able to convince you to do otherwise? This value right here, this value that we are good, that we need to do what we feel is right for us and who we truly are, is probably the biggest reason why the message of the cross just sounds like foolishness in our culture, or offensive even. Because what the cross says is that you are not good. The cross says that your heart is bent, and that following your heart, no matter where it's leading you, is going to lead to death. The cross says that sin must be punished. The cross says that we are wicked, so wicked that we deserve to be whipped and stretched and nailed to a cross to hang and die in not just pain, but shame for what we have done. The cross says, yes, this is what Dr. Nasser deserves. Absolutely. But the cross also says, this is what all of us deserve. All have sinned. All must face judgment. It's the last thing anyone wants to hear. The cross is ugly. The cross is offensive. And in this culture, in the culture of Corinth, in every culture, the word of the cross sounds like folly. So that is step 2 of Paul's paradigm. Choose offensive content for your speech. Step 3 seems just as foolish. Present this foolish content in a way that highlights your personal limitations and weakness as a public speaker. Verse 3, and I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling, and my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom. So this part right here, really what he's doing is he's highlighting the fundamental contrast that Paul wants to set up in this passage, which is the form of Paul's preaching and the form of most public speakers in his day. Like we mentioned a few weeks ago, public speaking, big business in the Roman Empire. Professional speakers with the title of rhetorician, they'd travel around from city to city like rock stars, the big ones at least. Smaller ones, just trying to make a name for themselves. They were kind of more like hired guns. You could hire a rhetorician if you wanted to have someone give a speech for you in court, or hire another one to come do a little bit of entertainment at your big dinner party or something like that. But well-known or obscure, the common quality between all these rhetoricians was this flashy, look at me, very ornate form of oratory that emphasized style and wit and honor. It would be the type of style that Paul calls lofty speech back in verse 1, or what he refers to again here as plausible words of wisdom. Another way to translate that would be convincing words of wisdom or persuasive words of wisdom, a manner of speaking in which the speaker is just so glorious, so artful, so magnificent in his oratory that he could just sell out a whole booth of ShamWow at the Puyallup Fair in 20 minutes. You've probably heard these guys. If they were born 2,000 years earlier, they would be traveling rhetoricians, and they may feel like they were born in the wrong time period because they'd probably kill it. This is precisely the kind of speaking that Paul does not do here. Instead, he speaks in weakness and fear and much trembling. Aristotle claimed that one of the key building blocks of persuasive speaking is something he called ethos. Anyone remember this from high school speech class? You have to memorize ethos, pathos, logos. Anyways, ethos is basically the sum of the qualities that you as a person bring to the table when it comes to persuasion, to getting people to trust you. It could be like your looks, your bearing, your voice, your social position, your eye contact, lack of eye contact. All that stuff combines to create your ethos. And if your ethos is bad, then it really doesn't matter how good your logic is or how good your arguments are. No one's going to listen to you. So Every good public speaker in the day would know that what you need to do, the key to winning your audience, is to emphasize those personal qualities which are your best while disguising those or hiding those which are your worst. In other words, you use your ethos, who you are, to leverage your argument. Well, this is exactly what Paul does not do here. I mean, look at the description right here. This is from Plutarch about the type of ethos a public speaker should display. He should be rich, handsome, well-born, and a king. Let's throw that last. I mean, someone might be like, okay. Oh, man, a king. Well, maybe not the right career for me. And then compare those qualities with Paul's ethos right here. And I was with you in weakness and fear and much trembling. This is not how you go about winning an audience. Are there any of you here old enough to remember the Nixon-Kennedy debates, 1960? Anyone actually watch them on TV? All right, great. I'd love to talk to some of you afterward. These debates made history by being the first ever televised presidential debates, and they are still pointed to by public speech experts as an example of the power of ethos. I remember when I was in college taking a public speaking class, we had to watch a clip of them. They're like a paradigm that way. And that's because Kennedy came across like a total champ on camera. He was bronzed and, had this great tan from weeks of open-air campaigning. Young, energetic, good-looking. He was used to television cameras, so he knew the trick that you need to look right at the camera when you're answering the question so it seems like you're talking to the audience. Nixon, he was like the complete opposite of that. He was recovering from a recent bout of the flu, so he was all pale. He tried to use this weird makeup powder to hide his chin stubble. He had shaved that morning, but he said his stubble grew so fast that just like 10 minutes later, he would have to put this stuff on. I can relate. Like, I shaved like 5 minutes before coming up here, and I think it's already coming out a little bit. I can feel it. It's just bizarre. But anyways, he put this stuff on, and it started totally melting off halfway through the debate. And then when he would answer the questions, he would always look right at the moderator, because the moderator had asked him the question. So he would look at the moderator, but on TV, it came across that he was like kind of shifty-eyed, or like avoiding eye contact with the audience. And then he had even banged his knee when he was getting out of the car earlier that day, aggravated an old knee injury, so he had to like limp his way across the stage. Kennedy, the picture of confidence, poise, and strength. Nixon was there in weakness and fear, much trembling, and melting. I mean, you can probably guess who won that election, right? This is why it is just so shocking that Paul chose to present the message of Jesus in the manner that he describes right here. And notice that I said the word chose, because Paul didn't have to do it this way. I mean, you look at the book of Acts, you can see that he spoke with confidence, boldness, and there is some brilliant oratory and rhetoric. Even right here in this letter, you can tell he knows how to play the game of persuasion when he wants to. Look back at verse 2. He says, I determined to do it this way. I decided to do this, to know nothing but the simple cross of Jesus, to forego this manner of flashy public speaking, fancy words, all that was so common, and instead speak in weakness, fear, much trembling. Why? Because he wanted to make it crystal clear to the people in Corinth that this was not at all about his own strengths or weaknesses in the first place. Step 4 of Paul's paradigm, watch the power of the Spirit change lives. Verse 4, and my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power. Now, it's kind of a weird verse to understand at first. What does it mean, in demonstration of the Spirit and of power? And it's demonstration singular, not plural. Really, that word demonstration, that is the key to understanding this whole passage, this whole crazy paradigm, in my opinion. That word there in Greek is apodoxis. It's translated as demonstration there. And that's actually a pretty good demonstration, or a good translation of it. The Greek word is a bit more technical than that. There's actually an article in the recent issue of the Journey of the Evangelical Theological Society that explores this term in detail. It was great timing for this sermon, and thank you to my friend Russ Glessner for passing it on to me. According to this article, this word apodaxis, it was a technical term among the rhetoricians of Paul's day, among those public speakers. It refers to the goal of a speech, proof, demonstrable evidence that then causes your audience to adopt your point of view. Really, this word evokes the sense of sight, that you've achieved apodaxis when your audience sees what you want them to see. And as a result of that new sight, they then change their behavior. You know, like if we read an article or watch a documentary today and then afterwards we say that it was eye-opening, that's the 21st century equivalent of apodaxis. Now we see, now we get it, hopefully now we believe, and now we change our behavior. This really was seen as the great privilege and power of the rhetorician, why they were so highly esteemed, because they had the power of apodaxis, to open eyes and as a result, change people. This is what's so striking about what Paul says here in this verse. Paul's lousy paradigm, which should do nothing at all, actually produces apodaxis, but not through the power of speech. What Paul points to here is apodaxis of the Spirit and of power, which is simply the powerful, convincing work of the Holy Spirit that allows you to see the beauty of Jesus for the first time. This apodaxis is of the Spirit because it is the Spirit of God who is the only one who is strong enough to do this, and it's of power because it's strong enough to break through absolutely every layer of sin, doubt, or cultural opposition and turn the heart of stone into a heart of flesh. This is the apodaxis of the Spirit, and really it is the key to Paul's whole paradigm. Step 4 right here. This is the only reason that Paul's lousy paradigm of public speaking is worth talking about. Seriously, like you take this one away, this whole thing is it's garbage. It's not going to change anybody. But if you add in the X factor of the Spirit, the S factor, I suppose, that changes everything. Because yes, the audience is hostile. Yes, the message is truly offensive. And yeah, you may not be the best presenter. But none of that matters if the Spirit is at work. We are so dead in our natural human state. We're so blinded by our pride and our culture and the devil, all of those things, that really the persuasive power of the Spirit is the only reason that anyone decides to trust Jesus, whether it's in Tacoma, whether it's in Corinth, anywhere, and the Spirit's power is strong enough to persuade absolutely anyone. Paul is a walking example of this. Now, I told you there'd be some encouragement in this passage. This is it, right here. Through the Spirit, God is powerful enough to change anyone, and he can use the weakest presentation of the gospel to do it. I know that for many of you here, the challenge in sharing Jesus isn't to just, do it in the first place, to talk to someone about Jesus the very first time. No, the challenge is to keep sharing it, time after time, year after year, to the same people that you love so much, who, for whatever reason, are not listening to you. Many of you have been doing this for decades with friends, neighbors, family members, maybe even a spouse or a child who doesn't know Jesus. And after sharing so many times, understandably, you're ready to give up. Maybe I'm not good at this, you think. Maybe their heart is too hard. Maybe I'm just too weak. And maybe all of that is true. But that is not true for the Spirit. That's the encouragement here. It is not up to you, ultimately. Praise God. Our responsibility is to continue to be faithful in our witness and trust God to use our weakness as a conduit for His power in His timing. It takes a lot of trust to do that. It takes a lot of faithfulness. Hopefully this passage inspires us to do just that. Because really that's the whole point. Summed up in the last verse, verse 5, the rationale for this whole lousy paradigm, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. What Paul says in this verse right here, really what it does is it ties our little passage here back with his big purpose in this letter so far. So you might remember from a couple weeks ago, the reason Paul writes this letter in the first place is because he's gotten word that this church in Corinth is falling apart. They're arguing. They're fighting. They've split up into these factions with one group following this leader, another group following this leader, another group following no leaders at all. It is a church in chaos. And all of these problems are rooted in what Paul identifies as an underlying attitude of competitive pride. Like who's better than who's connected with who got baptized by who, and in a word, as we described it a few weeks ago, seeking status. And all that is nonsense, Paul says. This attitude is so out of step with who Jesus is. It's out of step with what Jesus has done. That's just what Bruce preached the last 2 weeks. And then here in this passage, it is out of step with the example that I set when I was with you. This is why Paul points to his example here. It is to undermine their pride. Of course this paradigm sounds foolish. Paul's saying it is foolish. That's the point. This method shouldn't work, and the fact that it did work among you Corinthians should do two things. One, it should convince them that the only reason they believe in Jesus is because of God's power, not Paul's power. And two, show them that in light of this, that competitive, prideful attitude that's tearing them apart is just absurd. Or as I put it in your notes right there, the main point of Paul's paradigm in 1 Corinthians 2, 1 through 5 is to put the focus back where it belongs, which is on God, and to completely undermine the attitude of competitive pride that was tearing apart the church in Corinth. There's no basis for it. How can you be arguing about which leader is better when you realize it wasn't the leader's power that brought us to faith in the first place? How can you be splitting up into factions and jockeying for position and all that when the only reason that any of you is here is because of God's power and God's grace, nothing about you at all? It's absurd, but this prideful, self-focused mindset is so easy for Christians to slip into, back in Paul's day and back in ours. This is where we get to the gentle kick in the hindquarters. What keeps you from sharing the message of Jesus the way that you should? It's the question that we started with today. And so far, we've talked a lot about these kind of external barriers, these things outside of you that make it hard for you to share the message of Jesus. Culture, the hardness of people, the offensiveness of the message, maybe limitations that you have, all of that sort of thing. Now we're going to talk about an internal barrier. Perhaps the biggest one of all, a symptom, really, of that prideful mindset that was so common among the people in Corinth, and that is an attitude of self-reliance. Self-reliance is an attitude of thinking that when it comes to spreading the message of Jesus, it's all about you. Your intellect, your strategies, your strength. And self-reliance may be the number one thing that ruins your ability to share the message of Jesus. Why did Paul use this lousy paradigm? Why did Paul preach an offensive message to a hostile audience and weakness and fear and trembling so that it would be 100% crystal clear to everyone in Corinth that their faith was not the result of the wisdom of men, flashy preaching, good arguments, charisma, flair, but instead that there would be no doubt that the primary reason they believe in Jesus is due to the power of the triune God and his power alone, Father, Son, and Spirit. All three persons of the Godhead are involved here. Paul is preaching the testimony of God, verse 1, about Jesus, verse 2, confirmed by the Spirit, verse 4. Father, Son, and Spirit, start to finish, salvation is a collective work of God. And if that's the case, for us to have any whiff of pride or self-reliance that comes from pride, it's not only foolish and off base, it is dangerous. There's several reasons for this. For starters, when you take this attitude of self-reliance and apply it to the task of sharing Jesus, it makes you susceptible to the sin of vanity. Hey, look at me. Look at all my converts. I must be doing something great here. That's the sin of vanity. And then if things are not going well, self-reliance makes you susceptible to the sin of despair. Like, oh man, what's the point? Nobody ever listens to me. No one ever wants to follow Jesus. Might as well give up. And then no matter which end of that spectrum you end up, if things are going great, you're susceptible to vanity. If they're going bad, you're susceptible to despair. The great danger of the self-reliant Christian is always the danger of compromise. Either out of desperation to keep your success going because you really like the way that feels, or just out of frustration that nothing's ever working at all. You are tempted to change the message, to tone down the offensiveness, to modify things to keep getting results. And in short, you lose the cross. Vanity, despair, compromise, that is the path of self-reliance. Paul's paradigm shows us a better way. I'm going to close today with two more examples. This is the inspiration part. We've had the encouragement, we've had the kick. Hopefully this is where you get some inspiration. These are two more paradigms that represent distinct approaches to sharing the message of Jesus, both of which, interestingly, were actually made public on the same day, 2 weeks ago, January 24th, 2018. Totally separate contexts, same day, but both modeling for us two very different paradigms of sharing Jesus in a hostile culture. And I should say in advance, I'm putting these two side by side to serve as a stark contrast to one another. The first example is a negative one. The second example is a positive one, and together they really represent the dangers of self-reliance and the beauty of preaching nothing but Jesus Christ and Him crucified. The first paradigm is one that is recommended by a young man named Daniel Cox. Daniel Cox holds a master's degree and a PhD from Georgetown University. He's served as a research associate at the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. Recently published an article entitled, "Are White Evangelicals Sacrificing the Future in Search of the Past?" And Dr. Cox begins the article by pointing out really what he sees, rightly, I think, as some major challenges for those who want to share the message of Jesus in the United States. Quote, "Over the past couple of decades, Americans have become far more accepting on nearly every issue that fits under the rubric of sexual morality. Today, most Americans say that same-sex relationships, premarital sex, and having children out of wedlock are morally acceptable. And roughly 3/4 of the public has no qualms about divorce. The driver behind much of this change is generational turnover. A chasm has emerged between the views of young people and white evangelical Protestants. This may help explain why the religious profile of young adults today differs so dramatically from older Americans. Only 8% of young people identify as white evangelical Protestant, while 26% of senior citizens do." Like I said, so far I'm with Cox on all this. He has just confirmed really what we've been saying all along in this series. We are living in Corinth. If we decide to share the message of Jesus with our neighbors, we'll basically be following Paul's paradigm no matter what we try to do. We have chosen an audience that's predisposed to be hostile to our message. We've chosen to present content that they'll either find offensive or just really hard to understand. It's not anywhere in their basic framework. And to their eyes, we will seem weak, outdated, ignorant, bigoted perhaps. All this is true. Where Cox diverges from Paul's paradigm very significantly is at that key point, point number 4, the point of self-reliance. Here's what he says. He says, "Young white evangelicals are caught between their peers who are predisposed to embrace cultural pluralism and express tolerance for different personal behaviors, and then an evangelical tradition that staunchly resists changes in social, cultural, and religious norms. But this type of theological flexibility is what many younger evangelicals want. nearly half, 48% of white evangelical Protestants under 30 say that their church should adjust traditional beliefs and practices or adopt modern beliefs and practices. His ultimate recommendation, quote, "If white evangelical Protestants want to continue to be a home for younger Americans, they may have to reconsider what parts of Christianity are non-negotiable." This is the path of self-reliance. This is the path that ultimately demands compromise. And that's because the message of Jesus will always be offensive. It will always run contrary to at least some of the values of the larger culture, no matter where you are in history, no matter where you are in the world, because culture is always a product of humanity, and humanity is lost. The message of the cross is folly to those who are perishing. And so, if it's up to us, we Christians, to keep people coming to Jesus, and sustain our organizations and keep our political power or whatever it is that we're trying to do, the most effective way to do that is compromise, to tone down the foolishness a couple notches, or as Cox puts it here, to reconsider what parts of Christianity are non-negotiable. There is a better way, a much better way, a way that doesn't lead to compromise, but a way that leads to life. This is the way that we see in our final paradigm today, the example of Rachel Denhollander. So earlier I mentioned the trial of Dr. Larry Nassar, the man convicted of sexually assaulting those gymnasts during his time as doctor for the U.S. gymnastics team. And these girls, most of them women by now, were given the opportunity to speak at Nassar's trial, to share the damage that had been done to them and to ask the judge to consider this damage when handing down the sentence. The last victim who was permitted to speak was actually one of the first of Nassar's victims, a young woman named Rachel Denhollander. And she was given this prime position to speak because Denhollander was the first to publicly accuse Nassar. It was a really hard step for her to take, she said. At the time, he was this powerful, well-respected man who just, seemed untouchable. All these accusations were just bouncing off him. Denhollander is a lawyer. She's a wife and a mother of two. She's also a Christian. And in the middle of her 36-minute statement, which, by the way, was made on the very same day that Daniel Cox published that article, in the middle of that 36-minute statement, she took the opportunity face-to-face to confront Dr. Nassar with the message of the cross. What she said was broadcast to a national audience on CNN. It was a packed courtroom, but all along she was zeroed in on her true audience, the man who had abused her. Here's what she said. She said, "In our early hearings, you brought your Bible into the courtroom and you have spoken of praying for forgiveness. And so it is on that basis that I appeal to you. You spoke of praying for forgiveness. But Larry, if you have read the Bible you carry, you know forgiveness does not come from doing good things, as if good deeds can erase what you have done. It comes from repentance, which requires facing and acknowledging the truth about what you have done in all of its utter depravity and horror, without mitigation, without excuse, without acting as if good deeds can erase what you have seen in this courtroom today. The Bible you carry says it is better for a stone to be thrown around your neck and you thrown into a lake than for you to make even one child stumble. And you have damaged hundreds. The Bible you speak of carries a final judgment where all of God's wrath and eternal terror is poured out on men like you. Should you ever reach the point of truly facing what you have done, the guilt will be crushing. And that is what makes the gospel of Christ so sweet. because it extends grace and hope and mercy where none should be found. And it will be there for you. I pray that you experience the soul-crushing weight of guilt so you may someday experience true repentance and true forgiveness from God, which you need far more than forgiveness from me, though I extend that to you as well. What a bold public presentation of the powerful, the beautiful, the offensive message of the cross. It's offensive because the cross means that you are more wicked than you ever imagined, that you deserve hell no matter how much you say that you are good, that you are righteous. It is not true. The guilt that you bear should be crushing. And maybe the message is even more offensive to all who are listening, because the cross also means that forgiveness and freedom can be found by anyone, even a criminal like Nasser. Somebody already served your life sentence. Somebody already served the death sentence you didn't receive. Someone already took all your sin, all your guilt, all the terrible evil you committed, all of your shame, which you rightly deserve, and died for it on the cross. And in its place, you can have righteousness, true righteousness, peace, freedom, and life, all because of Jesus. This is what it looks like to know nothing but Jesus Christ and Him crucified. This is what it looks like to share the offensive message of the cross in a hostile culture. This is the paradigm of Paul. This is the paradigm of Rachel Den Hollander. Let us imitate them as they imitate Christ. Pray with me, please. Father, thank you for the cross. Thank you for your Son who bore all of our sin. Thank you for your Spirit, which helps us see the awfulness of who we are apart from you, and who helps us see the beauty of the provision you have given to us through your Son. I pray, Father, that if there is anyone here who has never seen this before, I pray for your Spirit to open their hearts, to open their eyes, to see what you offer them, the life that they've always dreamed of. I pray also for all of us here who do know you, that your Spirit would empower us to speak in our weakness to our neighbors in a way that you can use through a work of your Spirit to draw more people to yourself. We need you, Father. We pray this all on the basis of what Jesus has done, who Jesus is. Amen.